Good morning. What a treat to see all of your beautiful faces on the phone, and so grateful that you are all here. Welcome back. So good to be with you. Um, let's begin by thanking God for the gift of learning Torah together, and then we'll get right into it. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bachar banu mikol amim, v'natan lanu et Torato, Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah. So I also wanted to begin, before we begin, by just acknowledging that one of our beloved learners, Arthur Waldstein, passed away the week before Rosh Hashanah. And I don't know if Andrea is on the call or not, but Andrea and Arthur used to be regular learners. And I just wanted to acknowledge what a complete sweetheart he was, what a beautiful relationship they had for 40 years. And I hope if Andrea is on the phone, that she should get a lot of strength and support from our learning together. So may Arthur Waldstein rest in peace. We are going to be doing a lot about Israel this year. And I want to just jump in by asking a question. Of course, we're reading Danny Gordis's book, Israel, A Concise History of a Nation Reborn. And I have some different, in the season of Passover, the channel of the season of Passover, I have kind of four questions that flow, or four creative tensions that flow from his intro in his first chapter. But first, I want to ask you the question, what did you learn from the intro and the first chapter? What did you learn from the intro and the first chapter that you didn't already know, or that helps you? Oh, you read that and then you think about the news of the world, and it helps you put today's world in context. So that's how I want to start with that. What did you learn that you didn't know, or what did you learn that helps you frame how you see the world today? Anybody? Or anybody want to tackle that? Please, Paul, Kayla, so good to see you, and thank you.
Thank you. Well, one of the statements at the very beginning really turned me, well, it jingled my mind, let's put it that way.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
It's a good thing. It's a good thing. And it had to do with a statement by Mark Twain.
Yes, at the beginning.
And yes, and when he said, "I am not the Sultan, I am not objecting, but that concentration of the cunningest brains in the world, we're going to be made into a free country, that is Israel. I think it would be politic to stop it. It will not be well to let the race find out its strength." I was startled, absolutely startled by that comment. He begins by saying that Jews as a group are a very bright group, try to do the best that they can for civilization, actually, but because of that, they should not exist as a separate country.
Yeah, Paul, thank you. Yes, and that's how his book begins.
Yeah.
And in fact, I just want to say yes to that, and I want to add yes, and there's a creative tension in the way Danny Gordis begins his book with quoting Mark Twain that is resonant ad hayom hazeh until this very day, which is Twain begins by talking about how hated and despised, vulnerable and weak Jews are. The Jew is being legislated out of Russia, Mark Twain wrote in 1898. Spain decided to banish him 400 years ago. Austria about a couple centuries later. In all the ages, Christian Europe has curtailed his activities. Trade after trade was taken away from the Jew by statute till practically none was left. He was forbidden to engage in agriculture. He was forbidden to practice law. He was forbidden to practice medicine, except among Jews. He was forbidden the handcrafts. Even the seats of learning and the schools of science had to be closed against this tremendous antagonist. So Danny Gordis begins the book with this quote from Twain, which is about how despised and powerless we are. And by the end of that quote, Twain is saying, well, yeah, but you give Jews their own state, they're going to be so powerful. And I think so. I think one of my first theme, my first tension in this book, and you see it to this day, is the theme of Israel, of the Jewish people's powerlessness, that we are spurned, despised, massacred, exiled, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know, what Salah Baron called the lachrymose, view of history. You cry your way through Jewish history, and it's true. And the flip is, we're incredibly strong in Israel today, strong military, strong American Jewish community, et cetera. And that tension between we're so powerless and we're so powerful is on the first page of this book, in Twain's quote. Within Twain itself, both of those voices are found. By the way, I just want to say, I think that haunts and frames Israel today, Jews on college campuses, because you want to say to these Wellesley students, if you have natural sympathy for victims in history, for the oppressed, then sign us up. Like, nobody, if there were an Olympics competition for suffering, we win hands down. And it's not just the Holocaust. The Holocaust just grew out of 2,000 years of hate. It's all the stuff that Danny talks about in these first two chapters, the intro in chapter 1, all the stuff in Europe, Kishinev, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of us are here where we are because our ancestors left the Pale of Settlement because they were getting killed and massacred in the 1890s, 1880s, 1870s. And you want to say to Wellesley, don't you know, it's not just the Holocaust, it's like 2,000 years. But that's the first part of Twain. But then you have the second part of Twain. We got a nuclear reactor, we got we got F-15s, we got all these, cool Israeli pilots flying cool Israeli jets. We have an incredible army. So what do you mean powerless? Israel so powerful. And both are true within the same paragraph. So then I think that's one animating tension. So let me pause there. Other questions, thoughts about that tension that Paul started us off with. Thank you, Paul. Anybody? Maddie?
I was struck at the very beginning with the historic perspective that every time we showed signs of success and assimilation in any parts of the world, we were immediately shot down. We had a little window of success and assimilation, and then a tremendous amount of jealousy, I think, and greed. And all of our successes were flipped in a negative way. And that's been throughout history.
Yeah. By the way, there used to be a museum called the Diaspora Museum in Israel, which told that story. There used to be. And what it showed you was that exactly what you said, Maddie, that in every country, there was this trajectory where Jews made it, Jews were very successful, Jews were, incredibly loyal citizens, and then they got kicked out, or worse, killed. And then the question that you're left with, and the only exceptions to that are Israel. And the possible question that you're left with is America. And America is a little questionable. And that was the Diaspora Museum. And now I think asking that kind of question is too hot to handle. So the Diaspora Museum is no more. And it's now called Anu, we, us. And it's now, it tells a different story. The same museum is just recast. And that whole edge of we made it in all these countries and they kicked us out. Will they kick us out of America? Is now no more. And now we're just one people. Anu, so it's a kinder, gentler, softer museum. But it no longer asks that urgent question from Jewish history. Any other comments just about this first point? And it's a nuanced point. We're so powerless, we're so despised, we're so massacred, we're so expelled. And then the second half of Twain, and now we have a state and we're incredibly powerful. And holding both ends of that tension. And that, by the way, that's why college kids who are 20 years old, they don't know from Kishinev most of them don't even know from the Holocaust. They just know from Israel, the military force. They get one half of that, not the other half of that. Any other comments on that so far?
No one will jump you because you have a guy behind you. No, because
All right, Judy, if somebody could turn off who was on, and Judy Swartz, if you could unmute, please.
you back there, and then you gotta move.
Judy Swartz.
Okay, so I would say, but that is the tension of who we are as Jews, and we need to, on the one hand, all the persecution and the fact that we survived. That's unbelievable when you really think about it. And you go through the history of what went on in Europe and England and France and Spain and Portugal and Russia. I mean, that alone, before we even got this state, is nothing short of miraculous. It almost is jaw dropping.
Right.
And then so the kids who don't have any background and simply think Israel is militaristic, but Israel's army is for the most part governed by the prophets and the Torah and what have you, and nowhere in the world. What happened here?
I think keep going. I think you're okay.
Okay, nowhere in the world have we ever heard of an army that's humane, that drops notices and says, we're gonna come here and bomb or something, leave these places and so forth. We've never heard of an army that is supposedly governed by Torah in its greatest sense. I'm not saying they do everything right. We know all that, but it's not this militaristic, horrible thing that we see so many times portrayed in the paper. There's no background to understand they are governed by Torah.
Well, Judy, yes, and to be fair, I think there's a little more complex than that.
It's very nuanced.
Who here saw the film about Menachem Begin, Upheaval? Anyone see that on Sunday night? So, that's a whole separate conversation. But actually, Danny Gordis also wrote a biography of Menachem Begin, and I would love to read that with you because I just find him such a completely compelling figure. But Begin, on this point, Judy, of Taharat Neshek, the purity of arms, and that is no question a Jewish value, and it's enshrined in Israel's, founding documents, and it's enshrined in their military code, Taharat Neshek. That is absolutely true. Okay, and yet you see Begin, who, well before 1977, when he's elected prime minister during the Yishuv state, he bombs the King David Hotel. He bombs the King David Hotel. Menachem Begin is, and he says, you call me a terrorist, I call myself a freedom fighter. And then there's the whole Dar Yassin massacre. And then of course there's Sabra and Shatila in Lebanon. So yes, there is an ideal of Taharat Neshek, and yes, reality is often more complex. Anyway, so that's what I want to just kind of outline and then go deeper into these kind of four issues that I think come up that are very evocative from the first couple of chapters of the book. One is powerless versus powerful. Thank you, Paul. Here's the second one, which is not only did Israel embody a new homeland, but it embodied a new Jew and a new Judaism. A new Jew and a new Judaism. Danny Gordis uses the words revolution and rebellion, that it's a revolutionary zeal and it's a rebellion against the Judaism of old. So I want to talk about that, how Israel represents both of those. It's a homeland for the Jews, but it's also a new Jew and a new Judaism. Then a third kind of tension, I think, which is on every page of his book, but should be said, is what's the why for Israel, the why Israel? And there's both a negative energy and a positive energy valence, and they're both true, and they're both on every page of this book. The negative energy one is, so we have a place to live, a sanctuary from hatred and murder, so that never again will there be a Holocaust, and we have nowhere to go. That it's a sanctuary against anti-Semitism, And then it's a place of Jewish flourishing. One of Danny Gordis's points that he makes orally when he speaks and also in this book is in the same way that you flourish best when you're at home, every people flourishes best when it's at home. So Israel has this negative energy valence, no more Nazis, no more death, a place to go, and this positive energy valence. This is where we thrive, okay? And then finally, this is just an interesting intellectual idea. Danny Gordis talks about the predecessors to Herzl that nobody ever reads about unless you're an expert on Zionism. Hess, who wrote Rome and Jerusalem, and Pinsker, who wrote Auto Emancipation. And you have to be a graduate student in Zionist thought to even hear them. And Herzl writes his book, and he says, by the way, all my ideas are in these other books. But those books didn't pop. And his book popped. And that's just kind of an interesting question. What makes an idea pop? Because the content, according to Gordis, and according to Gordis, who quotes Herzl, on Herzl, the ideas of Herzl's book were not different. They were very comparable to the ideas of Hess and Pinsker, but Hess and Pinsker are footnotes in history. Only graduate students read them. And, you know, Herzl is Herzl. And so that's going to be our fourth question. So, so those are our three things. We've talked a little bit of powerless versus powerful. Now let's talk about the second one, which is Israel's a new Jew and a new Judaism. And I want to, I'm going to ask Rhiannon, if you could please just show on the screen page 4 and page 5 of the handout. Okay. And I'm reading, I just want to read a few of these paragraphs because they're very evocative, and then we'll have a conversation. I don't know if it's possible to make it any larger, Rhiannon, but if it's not, it's page 4 and 5 of your handout. You have it in you know, as well. Though it's a story of, I'm reading the second half of page 4. Though it's a story of a country, the story of Israel is also the story of a revolution, right? Revolution is a strong language. Zionism was the national liberation movement of the Jewish people, a movement committed to transforming the existential condition of the Jew. It was time, Zionists insisted, for the Jewish people to be reborn. In many ways, Zionism was a rebellion against the Judaism of old. As European Jews were attacked repeatedly and marginalized constantly, Zionist leaders began to argue that while Europe was obviously to blame, so too were the Jews. It was time for the Jews to refuse to be victims on call, living whatever they might call home until their host country decided to evict or murder its Jews, etc. And then, meanwhile, complained Zionist leaders, Jews remained passive, weak, fearful, huddled over ancient sacred texts instead of defending themselves and taking history into their own hands. And on page 5, I'm going to read the second paragraph. In the state of Israel, that new Jew has emerged. And he talks about, you know, the prime ministers who changed their names. I'll just read a little bit. Altering their names was a way of saying no more. It was time for a new Jewish worldview, a new Jewish physique, a new Jewish home, new Jewish names. It was a time for a new Jew, a Jewish people reborn. Okay. So now you can come. Thank you, Rhiannon. We can come back to the screen. So this is a thing that has taken me a lifetime to figure out, and I this is a perfect forum. How do you understand the new Jew and the new Judaism in Israel? Here's just one example. You know, we just finished the holidays. While we were in shul praying our hearts out, a lot of Israelis treat Yom Kippur as Yom Ofanayim, bicycle day, because you know, the people aren't on the roads. And so imagine you love to bike and you could go on the Mass Pike or 128 and there's no cars because all the people who are biking, you know, who would ordinarily be on the road are in synagogue. So Israel turns Yom Kippur into bicycle day, and they're cool with that. And they're living in a Hebrew speaking culture and everybody knows it's Yom Kippur. but beating their breasts and reciting 14th century religious poetry is not their jam. Being physically vigorous and biking 100 miles or whatever that is in their units, that's their deal, and that's their Judaism. So let's talk about that. Israel as a new Jew and Israel as a new Judaism, which is fundamentally different from ours. Please comment. Just love to hear your thoughts on that. Judy, and then love your voice, and then I would love to invite other people to share as well. Judy, please.
Okay, so in all due respect, you're talking about some Israelis who are secular and are not synagogue goers, but I also know a whole ton of young kids in both Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. I can't talk the other cities. You obviously know I have grandchildren who have moved there, who literally on every block, for instance, in Jerusalem, there are parks because of everything is like, we would think they're apartments, okay? At every park, there was an open show. And so our kids who happen to just belong to synagogues all came together in Jerusalem to be together and went on the 2 different days to different parks. And there were all done by young kids leading services. And it was much more Orthodox style. The boys were at one end, all right, in the playground. The women were at another end. So they were vigorous, they are smart, they are leaders, they are, you name it, business people and all that kind of stuff. They're not all as truthfully, when we look in our communities, not all our Jews are going to show by any shakes of the imagination.
Right. I'm not being critical. I'm just observing. And you're absolutely right. By the way, many of you, if you've been to Israel over the summer, you'll see Kabbalat Shabbat services, in malls or on the beach or in public spaces or in the Tachana, in Jerusalem where they have the big railroad station. In secular spaces, you have hundreds of people gathered for Kabbalat Shabbat service. That is people are getting their equivalent of Starbucks and kind of hanging out for a few minutes, where the words that are being sung are the words from Kabbalat Shabbat, and it's being done in the Israeli equivalent of Harvard Square or Newton Center or something like that. And so, yes, and parks, etc. And it's true, my nephew, who was supposed to get married last May during the war, and then it was postponed, the woman that he married is, just completely secular. A wonderful woman, Israeli woman, with Israeli parents and brothers, and they've all served, but they don't, they never have been to shul. Like they've never been to shul, including Yom Kippur. They've never been to shul, and they're Israeli and they're Jewish. So it's just a yes. It's a yes, and it's just worth noting. And I'm just wondering if anyone else has, and now no critique at all. God forbid, fabulous, but just different from our Judaism. By the way, and I think one of the at Israel at 75, one of the forces that's in the atmosphere that we need to work on is the drifting apart and the growing apart of these different communities, because how we express our identity is so very different. The way we express our identity is different from Bicycle Day or etc. So I think we have to be intentional about seeing and respecting and bringing our communities together when the expression of Judaism is different. Other voices, Peter, did I see your hand, or Annette? I'd love your voice.
I think you maybe just said what I was going to say, but the challenge is tolerance of all aspects of those who express their Judaism in different ways, and of people who express their lives and their beliefs in different ways. And that's a challenge for Israel, it's a challenge for us, and it's a challenge for the world. And in many ways, we're failing it. So I think the ability to bring together and to figure out how we can tolerate and share and respect.
Yes, amen to that. Amen. Thank you, Ned. Anyone else, just on how kind of unique it is to have a whole different Judaism that is flourishing, different from our own? Susan, so good to see you. Susan Kopelman. And if you could unmute, please, Susan. Susan, if you can unmute, please.
I don't think I can.
No, good.
Okay?
Yeah, you're perfect.
I think that I think one of the reasons that people can become secular and be secular in Israel is that you're not trying to define yourself as a Jew. Everyone knows you're a part of something so much bigger than you. Whereas when you live in another country, you are showing somebody else you are Jew by what you do.
Yes. Yes. By the way, while I'm noting the differences, I often think, I don't know if you guys ever think about your unlived life. Like, what's the life that you didn't live that you might have lived if you could have lived your life differently? Shira and I definitely think the unlived life that we could have lived and would have lived and should have lived was in Israel, raising our kids in Israel, living in Israel. I mean, I just have all the respect for people who do that. And I think in many ways, I mean, of course, every world has its own challenges, including the military and Miluim, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But Israeli Jews just seem to spike on meaning. They spike on meaning. They spike on, we're invested in a project that is of ultimate importance in a way that is perhaps more intuitive and obvious than it is for our kids here in America. Okay, I want to go to the third story, which is the why. It's always good to be in touch with the why of whatever it is that you care about. What's the why? And in the case of Israel, why does Israel matter so much? What's so interesting is there's a negative energy reason, which is absolutely true and powerful, which is the world hates us and we don't want to die at the hands of another Nazi regime. That's like literally true. And it's literally true to this day when you are in Israel. I'm heading out to Israel tonight in a few hours. When you're walking the streets of Israel, you will hear French being spoken because French Jews are moving to Israel in 2022. So there's a negative energy reason. We don't want to die from anti-Semitism, right? And there's a positive energy reason, which is we're home and we can flourish in the Jewish arts and Jewish culture and Jewish energy, et cetera, et cetera. I want to ask Rhiannon, can you go back to page 5, and then I'm going to have you also go to page 6. And you'll see both of this again. It's like the Twain quote. I'm looking on page 5, the last paragraph. Okay. Zionism was also a revolution against the very possibility that there could be Jews who would have no place on earth to call home. When mid-20th century Europe erupted in a paroxysm of genocidal hatred, many Jews had nowhere to flee to. The United States closed its borders, so too did Canada. The British blocked Jews who sought to go to Palestine. Boats loaded with hundreds of Jews sailed the seas, desperately seeking a place to dock, often unsuccessfully. On occasion, ships that set sail from Europe loaded with Jews fleeing the Holocaust had to return to Europe or purposely sunk by enemy ships simply because no one wanted surplus Jews. Zionism was determined to change that. It was committed to a world in which Jews would never again be homeless. Okay. And on that front, the creation of Israel brought a dream to fruition. So that's kind of a negative energy valence. I mean, it's important, especially if you're on that boat. But then look at the next paragraph, literally the next paragraph. After centuries of Jewish languishing and exile, Zionism was about restoring the Jewish people to the cultural richness that a people has when it lives in its ancestral homeland, speaks its own language, charts the course of its own future. If the Jews had been scattered to what the liturgy called the four corners of the earth, Zionists hoped to gather them back together once again, and then go down. There would be high culture and popular culture. Jews would live in the cities that their ancestors had known, would walk the same paths that had been home to their biblical forebears, and then Jewish leaders would make policy on war and peace, economics, healthcare, immigration. Zionism succeeded in all that and more. So what you have here, and then this is okay. Thank you, Rhiannon. So this is our third kind of a creative tension, which is why Israel, so that we don't die from Jew hatred. Why Israel, so that we flourish in our homeland. Jewish art, Jewish culture, Jewish startup nation, incredible advances in medicine, etc. And I wanted to just surface that tension. No more death from the Nazis, and winning Nobel Prizes in all the creative disciplines, because we can thrive in our own homeland. And wanted to offer that for your reaction. That, and I think Danny brings both of those valences up here. Thoughts, John?
Would the same creativity and accomplishment have happened in Argentina, which Herzl also considered? What does it have to do with being in the Middle East? And what if it has to do with getting a safe place together for people with talent? And that's a real question. And that's a question being asked of our college students. Why here in the middle of these Arabs' homes?
Yeah, right. So, so a couple of answers, and I've heard Danny talk about it, and it's throughout the book. You flourish, we flourish, all of us here flourish best when we are home. Like whatever, whatever the work that you did in your life, if we put you in a Ramada Inn in Malden and said, you're going to live in the Ramada Inn in Malden and now go and live your life, like you would be off. Or if we put you in a Ramada Inn or the equivalent in Argentina, you'd be off. Particularly, talk to Elias Rosenberg, where they hate Jews in Argentina. Particularly ask Elias and Lorena Rosenberg, where they actually bombed the JCC and killed hundreds of people and wounded hundreds of people. And nobody was ever called to account. Nobody's ever been prosecuted, charged, convicted. And Elias and Lorena will tell you, I mean, if you've ever heard him in Tamil class, it's just like, it's the first thing that he says is how he was constantly discriminated against by being Jewish in Argentina. But even if you didn't have that, if you live in the Ramada Inn in some place that's not your home, you're not going to flourish. And what I've heard Danny say is Israelis do so well in Israel because it is our home. And any human flourishes best when they're home. John.
My question isn't that. My question is, what if our home was Argentina? A part of Argentina where we gathered, where we grew, where we got powerful, where, I mean, Israel is not an island. It is connected to other things. Right. And Argentina also is not an island. So I'm really wondering whether the same thing couldn't have happened there. And that would be our home, and that would feel comfortable. That wouldn't be a Ramada Inn. And we aren't safe in the Middle East either.
Yeah, but
so that remains a question for me.
John, how does your question get influenced by the realities of Jewish history? That in all of these countries, Jews thought they were home, including, by the way, Germany. I mean, some of German army's most courageous warriors in World War I were Jews. And these Jews thought in between World War I and Hitler, well, I've got unimpeachable street cred as a German patriot because I lost my arm, I lost my leg in World War I fighting for the German army, and they were sent to the crematoria. So doesn't that kind of answer your question? No. Unfortunately, why not?
It doesn't answer my question. If the UN had created a state called Israel in Argentina, it would have the same amount of safety as the UN creating a state called Israel in the Middle East.
And John, question, why?
Connection, I understand.
Right. Why are you asking that question 75 years and 7 million Jews in Israel later?
Because you have posed it as that was the only place. And even Herzl said it was not the only place. And that is relevant to today's college students. Why?
Well, okay, so yeah. So then here's one last thing that you haven't factored in, John, or the college students don't factor in, is that Israel is actually the Jewish people's home. I mean, the Bible comes from Israel. All the archaeology, all the sticks and the stones and the temple and all the Temple Mount and all the that's why archaeology is more than archaeology. Archaeology is evidence of an indigenous connection. We actually have no connection to Argentina, and we actually have no connection to Uganda, but we have a long-standing connection to the land of Israel and the very land of Israel and what's buried in the land and the skeletons buried in the land and the rocks and stones buried in the land testify to that very ancient connection. So, I mean, I think, I guess one thing I would say is one of the words you will always use, and the Wellesley students used it, and college students use this, is they call Israel's colonialism. And colonialism is where, England goes to India and just takes land that it does not have any connection, or France goes to Morocco or Algiers, has no connection. But the Jewish people went home, and literally the land itself testifies to that. They don't want to hear that, but that is actually the case. Okay. Anybody else on negative energy, on positive energy, and how we think about that creative tension? Paul Kalis.
Following John, home changes with increasing age. To young people, home is where they're born, where they go to school, where they work, where they love. And for most American Jews, it is America. As we get older, we start thinking of things in a different way. And we then can take the idea of having two homes, one America and one Israel. It's a matter of, do you describe yourself as a Jewish American or an American Jew? And this is very, very difficult. But I would estimate that most young people look upon America, regardless of their religion, as their home. That's just.
And Paul, what about you in this age and stage of your life? Does Israel in any sense feel like it's a home for you?
No, America is home for me, but I see the importance of Israel for other people, because other people may feel differently. And it's important that Israel survive as a going enterprise, because we never know what's going to happen. Right. I would have been one of those Germans who said, I'm as German could be. Nothing's going to ever happen to me. And I know it's possible no matter where you live. But for my life, all my life, America has been my home. I mean, I've been to Israel a couple of times and always thought highly of it. But nevertheless, my home is America.
Okay. I want to step back and ask you about these. I want to summarize again these three creative tensions, and then ask you a question about how they enable you to interpret our universe. So Danny Gordis talks about the creative tension that we're powerless and very powerful. He talks about the creative tension that Israel created a new homeland for the Jewish people, and in the process created a new Jew and a new Judaism. And he talked about the creative tension between a negative energy why for Israel, namely we don't die. The why is we don't die because we have a place to go. And a positive energy, we flourish, Hebrew poetry, Hebrew literature, Israeli science, Israeli medicine, startup nation, etc. Now here's my question. I have been so bothered, as I think many of you have been bothered, by the hatred of Jews and the Jewish state on college campuses. And, when I think about, Wellesley is on my mind because it's just so cool. I was in Wellesley on Sunday with Shira. Wellesley is home. Wellesley is 15-minute drive from my home. Wellesley is 15 minutes from this shul. And the notion of 20-year-olds at Wellesley, 15 minutes from Temple Emmanuel, hating the Jewish state so much that they would say, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. The notion of 20-year-olds hating the Jewish people so much that they would endorse the mapping project. It made me think about the way that both Elie Wiesel and Abraham Joshua Heschel, who lived through the 30s and 40s in Europe, they both talk about a madness descending. They both use that phrase, madness. That a madness descended on Europe, and people became mad with hate against the Jewish people. Wiesel speaks about that. Heschel speaks about that. Madness. And they found themselves attracted to a madman and to a mad regime. And of course, Wiesel talks about how they were nice to their cats and nice to their grandmothers at the same time. So my question, I was thinking about, how could 20-year-olds endorse the mapping project? And how could 20-year-olds not see the second 6 million and not care about the second 6 million? So I'm wondering, does this book, and I know we've only read a couple of chapters, but does it offer any insights into understanding that madness? Anybody? Well, let's bracket that as a question. My hope for this book is that it will enable us not only to understand Israel better, but to see how Israel is understood in the world better. And I want to just name that as an open question. It's not a rhetorical question. I'm trying to figure out how 20-year-olds could hate Israel that much. And if you have any wisdom that comes from this book or otherwise, would love your voices. I want to just, I want to move to the last one, which is a lovelier question, and it's a more interesting question, which is this issue of what makes an idea pop. Rhiannon, if you could turn to page 24 and 25. And so here's 24. And in this part, Danny Gordis gives kind of the intellectual history of the precursors of Herzl's book, The Jewish State. So he writes, in 1862, Hess wrote Rome and Jerusalem, in which he argued that for Jews, Europe's welcome would forever be tenuous. We shall always remain strangers among the nations. They may tolerate us and even grant us emancipation, but they will never respect us as long as we place the principle of wherever things go well, there's one's homeland above our own great national memories. Jews should return to Palestine, the ancestral homeland of which they had dreamed and spoken for millennia, where they should work the land and create a socialist society. And then he writes, though now considered a critical text in the history of political Zionism, Rome and Jerusalem was virtually ignored while Hess was alive. Jews were not concerned enough about the future of Jewish life in Europe to take him seriously. And then when Herzl finally did read Rome and Jerusalem, only after he'd written The Jewish State, he wrote, everything we tried is already there in his book. And by the way, the same kind of phenomenon happens with Pinsker's book about auto emancipation. Okay. And then if you look on page 25, just one sentence, against this slowly, this is second half of page 25, against the slowly unfolding background of early Zionist stirrings, Herzl's book, unlike those that had been written earlier, took the world by storm. So profound was the excitement generated by the Jewish state that by early March 1896, just weeks after the book was published, someone proposed to Herzl the idea of a Zionist Congress, and he seized on it. In fact, it consumed him. So thank you, Rhiannon. So here's my question, and it's just like, to me, it's a very rich, delicious question. Hess says the same thing as Herzl, even according to Herzl, says the same thing, and it's basically ignored. Pinsker says the same thing as Herzl, and it's basically ignored. And Herzl says it, he's the third guy to the party, and it starts the first Zionist Congress. So my question to you is, what do we learn about what makes an idea pop? Butch Pemstein. And you have to unmute, please, Butch.
First off, Herzl wrote right after the Dreyfus affair, so that people were quite aware of what was happening. Secondly, Herzl's book is nothing if not very, very easy to read and understand. The other two were deep and difficult to read. I'm not sure whether they were in German or in Russian, but Herzl was nothing if not a good writer, and his writing was very, very good. And the book itself describes a nirvana, a wonderful state where everybody lives in perfect freedom and everybody is nice to one another and nobody has real problems. So that it was utopia. And that's, I think, one of the reasons that it became so wildly important.
So what I hear you saying, Butch, is really three things. One is context. You mentioned the Dreyfus affair, so people were really focused on it. It was also, by the way, after Kishinev in 1890.
Right.
You know, Kishinev was very much a bloody precursor to the Shoah, very, very bloody precursor to the Shoah. And there had also been pogroms in the 80s and 70s and the 1800s. So there was just a lot of blood in the air. And then Dreyfus in Western Europe and France. Second, his book was easy to read, clear, simple, accessible. And then third, that in its utopianism, it was hopeful and optimistic. So you give some, so it's a time that's desperate and sad and broken. And now you have a vision that is clear and accessible and relatable and hopeful and optimistic. And that particular combination made it pop. Thank you, Butch. What do we learn from the explosion of Herzl's idea? Explosion in a good way, that it took the world by storm. What do we learn about how to communicate in our own time? Anything? Anybody want to talk about that? So just at the risk of stating the obvious, I think all three of the points that Butch brings up remain very true. And as you think about midterms and the complexities of history that we find ourselves in, first of all, context continues to matter a lot. Whether, you know, the daily is today is about how Europe's energy prices and what it means to Europeans living in EU countries for their energy bills is creating really extreme politics and real instability. So, you know, political context, economic context, hardship, adversity, all that governs, shapes how ideas are received then and now. Just listen to the daily today. Second, the best argument is simple. And third, the best argument is hopeful, right? I've been talking to Michelle and Eliza. We can't be given any more sermons about how the world is broken. Nobody wants to hear about how the world is broken. People want to hear hopeful then and now. So I think all of that explains in part, the success of Herzl's book. And it also explains what makes ideas fly today, which leads me to my last point, which is I would love to invite everyone who's on the call. We have 43 screens at the moment, to come to a meeting in the shul on Sunday morning, November 6th, so a week from this Sunday, at 10 o'clock in the Benjamin Vestry. Just come. And Shira and I will be there. And Amy Klein and Brian Leskey will be there. I really want to invite all of you to take seriously the idea of coming to Israel on the Spark mission. Israel turns 75 on April 26th. It's the 75th. This is a miracle of our time. And I just think no one is going to regret going on this mission. And you may regret it if this historic moment passes and you're not on it. There's going to be, a huge contingent from the synagogue, from Temple Emmanuel. I'm going to be there. Shira's going to be there. There's a lot of teaching beforehand. Hartman is partnering with us on content. So if you really want to double click on Israel at 75, there's going to be a lot of Hartman content in the shul that I'm working with people on in the months before we go, April 18th. There's also Greater Boston. There's going to be a lot of energy from Greater Boston. And also you're going to be in this Jewish homeland on the 75th anniversary. How cool is that? So I'm not even asking you to come to Israel now. I'm just asking you to come to a meeting. Come to a meeting on November 6th in the Benjamin Vestry at 10 o'clock. It's a free country. You could always say no. But I am just asking you to give this serious consideration, because as the rabbis teach us, avar zaman batal korbanot, when the time passes for the time-bound sacrifice, you can't offer it, or opportunity has short forelocks and long back hairs. If you don't grab it while it's coming towards you, you can't grab it once it passes you. So this is the time to think about it. November 6th at 10 o'clock. Let's talk about joining this trip. I mean, I love reading about Israel. Even better to go to Israel together. So put that on your calendar if you would. For next week, please read the next chapter, which is chapter 2. And let me frame that. Danny talks about how the modern story of the modern Jewish homeland is in many ways foreshadowed by the biblical story of our homeland. Namely, the Jews come from a place of brokenness and desperation, slavery, wilderness wandering, pogroms, the Holocaust, right? So vulnerability in the Bible, vulnerability in Eastern Europe, vulnerability in Western Europe. A broken people goes to Eretz Israel. Point, check. Oh, by the way, there's already a people there, right? There's the 7 Canaanite nations, and there's no shortage of Palestinians. In both cases, there's a lot of international tension. The Bible talks about Egypt not really liking Israel, and Assyria not really liking Israel, and Babylonia not really liking Israel. It's always a creative tension with the neighborhood that we're in. It talks about problems of leadership, that all the leaders of biblical Israel failed the Jewish people. How many elections is Israel having now? How unstable is its current government? He talks about how the divide and division and fractiousness and dysfunction of the Jewish people when we had a Jewish state doomed the Jewish state. And I don't need to tell you how broken and dysfunctional and fractious our people is today. So when you look at, this next chapter is about trends, and you're going to read the biblical story and say, hey, that's us, that's us, that's us. And here's the obvious question. The way the biblical story ends is with the destruction of the first temple and the destruction of the second temple and the destruction of the first Commonwealth and the destruction of the second Commonwealth. So what do we learn from our history so that we don't repeat it? That's for next week. Guys, can I just say, love you and love this hour. And thank you so much. I am heading off to Israel tonight. I will be back by next Tuesday and put November 6th on your calendar. I will see you with Shira and Amy and Brian at 10 o'clock. Lots of love, guys. Bye.
Have a safe trip. Geh
Thank you.
gesund,
Thank you.
komm gesund.
Thank you.